on constitutional government, such sweet sounding names. The Pelican State, Louisiana, they don't pull any punches. The Pelican State formed the Louisiana Joint Legislative Committee on Segregation. Didn't even try to mask it. Just came out and said it. Arguably the most notorious body resided in Florida. Following the lead of other southern states, Charlie Johns, president of the Florida State Senate, leader of the Pork Chop Gang, which is what they called themselves, leader of the Pork Chop Gang, a group of segregationist North Florida Democrats, helped to create the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, or FLIC, which is much more fun to say, in 1956. In 1953, Johns had aimed to create a special investigating committee within the legislature to curb gambling, crime, and other vices. You can use your imagination what those other vices might be. He proclaimed, "I plan now to introduce and fight for legislation to create a state FBI. A state investigative force is an absolute must." His motion had been defeated on the Senate floor, but of course after the Brown decision, it easily passed. And the Johns Committee, as it was better known, was born. Its intent, which was similar to the Georgia Commission on Education, was to make as complete an investigation as time permits of all organizations whose principles or activities include course of conduct on the part of any person or group which would constitute violence or a violation of the state laws or would be inimical to the well-being and orderly pursuits of their personal and business activities by the majority of the citizens of the state. This committee, like the others in nearly all Deep South states, would investigate quote-unquote extremist activities. And what they meant were the extremist activities of the NAACP and the extremist activities of other pro-integration groups of, quote, paid communist employees, sympathizers, or other agitators. One member of this group lamented, "Whenever you try to preserve America for Americans, this is the type of obstruction you run into. Russia won't have to fire an atom bomb at this nation. They're going to take us over from within. We had better wake up and try to do something." Interestingly, Georgia's committee initially tried to reassure the public that they would not engage in witch hunts, but rather would be composed of, quote, moderates, ones who would not become hysterical or who are not easily susceptible to mob or emotional influence. A Georgia legislator noted, our entire concern was not directed against colored people, but rather against ideas alien to our nature and custom. We were not fighting them and them alone, or degrading and debasing them, but fighting for the ideals of our country in an attempt to combat international militant communism that we so greatly fear. Charlie Johns, who dominated Florida politics for 2 decades, used his committee to terrorize not only the NAACP in the 1950s, but also Florida's homosexual community, mostly at institutions of higher learning. The Johns Committee embarked on a witch hunt from 1956 to 1960, using undercover police officers and a large informant ring at the University of Florida, which ultimately resulted in the termination of more than 29 faculty members from the state's flagship university, and at least the suicide of one faculty member at the University of Florida. There were also investigations at Florida State University, the University of Miami, and an assault on liberalism and academic freedom at the University of South Florida, the state's brand new university in the early 1960s. The success of these committees could be measured by using different variables. But in 1961, the United States Civil Rights Commission issued a report listing states doing the most to maintain racial segregation at public schools and colleges. Predictably, they listed all of the Deep South states: Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. As McCarthyism swept across Georgia and the Deep South, Don West was in Texas, working for the Farmers Union and the Home Mission Council as a labor organizer and as a writer for the Southern Farmer, all while trying to ignore Ralph McGill, the attacks from Talmadge and others. All of his activism, though, brought persistent FBI surveillance, determined on connecting his work and the organizations he represented to the Communist Party. Out of these travels and trials, West composed one of his most controversial works, at least in the eyes of his opponents, The Road is Rocky, a poetry collection that challenged McCarthyism. The book drew the ire of the FBI in San Antonio, who sent Director J. Edgar Hoover a complete list of all of West's communist affiliations and activities dating back to the 1930s. What West did not know was that he had been named in front of HUAC in 1949 for his labor activities in the 1930s, and that the FBI already had open files on him. In 1952, and this is quite possibly my favorite part, in 1952, he had also been accused of leading a communist plot to destabilize the Boy Scouts. So there's that. West responded to all of these attacks by flatly stating, "I am not a communist now, I am a Georgia farmer." In 1953, West left Texas in despair and depression, finally landing in the small northwest Georgia community of Dalton, at the invitation of Reverend Charles T. Pratt, pastor of the Church of God of the Union Assembly. Pratt wanted West to come to Whitfield County to become the editor of a new newspaper that would serve as the mouthpiece of his church and foster social progress and union activism in the region. With no other options, and close to his birthplace of Devil's Hollow in Gilmer County, West accepted and joined as a preacher as well in 1954. In 1954, Dalton had a population of a mere 16,000, but this was double its size in 1930, largely due to an influx of industry, which was seen as a blessing and a curse. As Dalton and the region modernized, many felt their way of life was being threatened. His new publication in Dalton, The Southerner, like all his other works, quickly drew the ire and scorn of the FBI, local newspapermen, politicians, and business owners. The paper's message was pro-union and could count close to 5,000 paid subscribers by 1955. Soon, workers in Dalton wanted more. They asked West to help them organize unions in their local plants. While he declined, he he did put them in contact with the Textile Workers Union of America, who sent local representatives to Dalton to organize the Latex Company and the Bellcraft Company. The company bosses blamed West and their ally, Congressman Henderson Lanham, a staunch segregationist living in Rome, well, representing Rome, was able to access West's HUAC files, which were subsequently forwarded to Dalton. In response to local labor leaders, where did I break?
Nothing.
In response to pressure, local labor leaders contacted the National TWUA demanding they sever ties with West and Pratt. Ultimately, it was the plant bosses that weakened the union position by firing employees who were also members of Pratt's church. Destroying the labor unions was the goal, and West's presence made the job easier because their opponents could tie the movement to communism. Soon, a local Ralph McGill emerged in Mark Pace, the editor of the Dalton News and Dalton Citizen. Pace, described as a dynamic young journalist by the Chattanooga Press, recently passed away in 2015 at the age of 101 after serving as the editor of Dalton's Daily Citizen for 37 years. The Wauchula, Florida native was a racial moderate and was named Dalton's Man of the Year in 1957. He was also honored on numerous occasions by the Georgia Press Association. In 1954, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation approached Pace about informing on West, and Pace readily complied. Pace fired the first shot in August with a front-page expose in the Dalton News pulled directly from the HUAC files, followed by several more articles which basically repeated McGill's previous charges from the Atlanta paper. West was not a new name, as Pace became acquainted with him in 1948 when Pratt and West brought Henry Wallace to Dalton for a rally during the former vice president's ill-fated campaign for president under the Progressive Party banner. At the time, Pace regarded West as nothing more than another misguided socialist. But by 1955, Pace was convinced the labor activist was a full-fledged communist worth keeping an eye on. For his part, West's first impression of Pace was not too flattering. Meeting Pace to inform him that West was set to launch a new publication, The Southerner, he noted that Pace was, quote, sort of pathetic, a weak little fellow who has a string around his neck. No idea what that means. In face of Pace's attacks, West was steadfast in his faith, but the words of Luther Broom, Dalton's fire chief, shook West to his core. Speaking to a TWUA organizer passing through Dalton on his way to Tennessee, Broom asked him to stay and watch some real excitement after a damn communist was lynched. Though nothing came of this, the attacks intensified in the form of a campaign waged by the local chapter of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, maintaining that West speak to his HUAC record and Communist Party membership. West took the bait and attempted to defend himself in a letter to the Dalton Citizen in which he attacked McCarthyism, denied that he was a communist, and derided what he saw as an effort to derail the unionization of the workers. The seesaw battle continued as workers were targeted, both verbally and physically. with several being beaten, having their property destroyed, and 26 losing their jobs at both Belcraft and Latex. Even the Southerners' offices were vandalized. In defiance, Latex workers went on strike, which was met by state troopers sent in by Governor Marvin Griffin. This ended the strike, bringing the movement near to a close. Smelling blood in the water, Pace went in for the kill. He requested more recent information on West from the FBI, but was rebuked. He asked the GBI, who obtained information from the FBI that alerted him to the fact that West had not been affiliated with the Communist Party since 1950 and had actually been removed from the Federal Bureau's Security Index in 1955 due to inactivity. A minor setback, but Pace kept up the pressure. His ultimate goal was to get a grand jury to consider the case, and his prospects were rejuvenated in October when the Whitfield County grand jury took up communism, acting as a mini HUAC to investigate the charges Pace had brought against West. Anti-communist leaders from Illinois and South Carolina traveled to Dalton in the following weeks to plead the case against West, comparing him to a cancer of infiltration under the guise of religion, education, and labor unions. West finally received his subpoena in late October, and he used his appearance as an opportunity to preach his cause to the national media as much as the Dalton press. He labeled it the Dalton Red Scare and compared himself to Jesus. The appearance came to nothing as West refused to answer questions pleading the Fifth Amendment. The final chapter came in December when plant workers cast their votes to unionize. Much to West's dismay, only 43% voted in favor. In the following weeks, Pace revealed in The Citizen that some of West's writings had been displayed and sold in a communist bookstore in Chicago. These attacks were not meant as a parting salvo aimed at West, but rather a means to push him out of Dalton. Pace's efforts were successful as he painted Pratt into a corner. Pratt required all ministers working under him to publicly swear an oath that they were not communists. West had repeatedly refused to discuss all his prior endeavors before 1952. This satisfied neither Pratt nor the county solicitor who would administer the loyalty oath. When pushed to cooperate, West resigned from the church, who also simultaneously expelled him. Leaving Dalton, West headed for Blairsville, some 75 miles to the northeast in Union County, close to the North Carolina border. His mother lived there. She owned a shop and operated a store that he had bought and set up for her there. As he drove over Fort Mountain on a winding mountain road, he spotted a car tailing him. As the car approached, it started to crowd him and attempted to force him off the road. He was keenly aware that several weeks earlier, labor organizers had been forced off the road into a ditch. So he calmly reached for the .38 caliber revolver on the passenger seat next to him and unloaded into the tires of his pursuer. He then calmly continued on the rest of his journey unmolested. Ironically, any chance the Dalton labor movement had of success died the moment Don West was brought in to save it. McCarthyism triumphed in this little corner of Northwest Georgia. Thank you.
We'll take a few minutes now to field some questions if anyone has them.
Dr. Black's not a question. I was made aware when we started tonight that there was a lady in the room who actually grew up with Don West. Is that correct, too?
I knew Don West. He stayed at our house 62 years ago.
Wow.
We didn't know anything about him.
Well, I'd love to talk to you after.
Are there any questions?
Okay.
So what do you take away from all that?
How long do you have?
What do you think the implication is that with the progressive movement today? What can we learn from that?
I think what we can learn from it without getting too political, that I probably shouldn't answer it, but what we can learn from it is that we have to be careful in not framing things in a nationalistic cause that otherwise shouldn't be. Meaning in this case, they used the fear of communism to try to halt integration, to try to halt anything that was seen as a threat to the norm. And it's very easy to call something unpatriotic to try to stop it, because you shouldn't be able to fight against something that's un-American. You shouldn't be able to do something that's un-American. So if somebody labels something un-American, then everybody should rally to the other side of that. And that's what was attempted and was largely successful throughout the South in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Because, you know, McCarthy himself was only in power for 4 years. But in the South, McCarthyism was around for a decade or longer. And it was because they used this fear of communism, patriotism, and all these things to paint things that they were against as unpatriotic. So I think it's a lesson we could and should remember today.
Professor, my good friend Judy Aldridge down here, she told me initially about Don West and recommended the book, A Hard Life.
Hard Journey.
I ordered it, Hard Journey.
Yeah.
I ordered it a couple of years ago and didn't begin reading it until I saw where you were coming, so I haven't gotten through all of it. And this is kind of off topic, but he was very concerned about the Appalachian way of life being lost.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of that went into his founding of the public school.
Right.
Which also provided him a platform for the social gospel that he learned about. What I found interesting was that he chose ministry after he was expelled from Barry and LMU, and he was always seen to be a loggerhead with authority, a real maverick. That later in life, he became very cantankerous and was disillusioned when the wall fell in 1989. And I work in Gilmer County, so this is a very interesting topic, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Sure. And he, after leaving Georgia, he goes to Baltimore and eventually ends up settling in West Virginia. And he has him and his wife set up a folk center in,
Upstate.
I think it's Charleston, West Virginia?
Upstate.
Possibly West Virginia. In West Virginia, that's still very active today. So it's it's very concerned with the whole region, from Georgia up to, Maryland.
They saw manufacturing. It's just a different time. People were so poor, and manufacturing was the way out. But he saw that way of life leaving as they left to left the area to go find jobs.
Just share stories here. I grew up in China. My early part of life was kind of grew up in the Cold War era. Some crazy things happened in China. It's not a shock to see a story of what happened in the United States. The story I want to share with you was, John Hodgson knows, I told him once. When I started my job here at Dalton State, and for my first year, I saw some teaching evaluation come back, which was a written statement from a student. The student said, "Oh, this guy says so many good things about China, he must be a communist, fire him." He said, "Wow, that's joke or something." Wow, that's not that how students think about you if you say something nice.
I chose to ignore those.
Remember that?
I remember them well.
Something nice about China. I said, "Wow, you guys be indoctrinated. Everything you said about you heard about China is the evil, is the bad." Same thing, like we heard about the United States, terrible, evil. All happens for us specifically. Good point.
Were there any connections with all this, however tenuous, with the earlier Red Scare following the First World War?
You mean, with what specifically?
Well,
The
any of
labor?
what you talked about tonight, any of the McCarthyism in the South, I doubt if that reached into Northwest Georgia.
Yes, in the sense that you could tie the American Communist Party's growth in the South going back a little bit to that, but not really in the sense that this is more coming because of integration and the modern civil rights movement, but really say the beginning of it is around the Depression. So about 10 years after it. So it's kind of the same.
But it's nobody at that time comparable to McCarthy, unless it's a neutral Palmer.
Palmer would be, Palmer would be the
But there was
closest.
a rash of race riots in various parts of the country at that time.
You have, not in the same way. I wouldn't say you have the same using communism or anti-communism for racial reasons in the South at that time. I wouldn't say that there's the same thing. You use other things for it, obviously, but I wouldn't say communism, except in individual cases like Paul Robeson, although a little later, and then also A. Philip Randolph when he first gets started. But again, it's a little later. He doesn't really come out as a socialist until the mid-20s and 30s. So it's still a little later.
Does the Klan play a role in any of this?
In this specifically?
Yeah.
It does. Again, not as much in Georgia. The Klan plays a bigger role in Mississippi because they're always in Mississippi. The Klan plays a big role in Florida because the Klan played a huge role in Florida, but honestly not as much a role in Georgia. The Klan was bigger in Georgia in the teens and in the early 20s. It's not as big in the 50s as it is in Mississippi or Florida during that time.
Well, how about another round of applause for Dr. White? And once again, all students, make sure you sign in on the treatment outside. Thank you again for coming out tonight, and get a cookie.